The Appalachian Trail is a beautiful trail that stretches more than 2,000 miles over 14 states. This trail provides many beautiful scenic spaces as well as spots for recreational activities such as hiking, swimming, and camping. Although the Appalachian Trail is a fun pastime for people, it faces a number of environmental threats. Although the environmental threats are difficult to face, the trail management is working to resolve them and prevent them from happening in the future. Before we dig further into the problems and solutions, you should know some history. According to AppalachianTrail.org, in October 1921, regional planner Benton McKay went public with his proposal for an Appalachian Trail, a project in regional planning. A New York newspaper columnist publicized this and spent years working on a network of trail and government contacts. By March 1925, McKay had generated enough support to organize an Appalachian Trail conference and work on a more specific plan. Toward the end of the 20s, Arthur Perkins of the Appalachian Mountain Club took over the reins of the ATC from McKay. McKay had made very little progress in his time working on the trail, other than connecting existing trails together. Myron H. Avery began to draw his attention toward the progress of Perkins, and succeeded him as head of the ATC. Avery accelerated the progress, and in August 1937, a footpath was indeed complete from Maine to Georgia, and Avery and National Park Service allies were well into a plan for building overnight shelters along the 2,000-mile trail. In 1938, a hurricane severely damaged the trail, especially in New England. Many of the volunteers who helped maintain it were being called to serve in World War II. The destroyed trail was almost forgotten. 3 years after the war, however, a recovering veteran, Earl Schaefer, was able to locate enough of the trail to hike from Georgia to Maine in a single journey, and because of his success, in the spring of 1951, the Appalachian Trail was declared open again. With future generations of hikers in mind, legislation was passed in 1968 called the National Trail System Act. This act establishes classes of trails. The Appalachian was the first trail classified as a National Scenic Trail and was now considered part of the National Park System. A National Scenic Trail is, by definition, for the identification and protection of the historic route and its historic remnants and artifacts for public use and enjoyment. From that moment on, it would be under federal protection. According to AmericanTrails.org, several million people set foot on the Appalachian Trail each year. Most of them only walk for a few miles, but some people devote weeks and even months to hiking on this trail for hundreds to thousands of miles at a time. AmericanTrails.org also says that the impacts associated with this level of visitor use are a significant challenge for managers. Not only are there direct impacts to soil, vegetation, water, and wildlife, there are impacts to other visitors as well. They also make mention of the impacts being mainly concentrated to the Appalachian Trail footpath. According to the managers, most of the environmental impacts are unavoidable with the intent of the trail, but they are in the process of attempting to avoid the impacts that are non-essential, such as campers felling trees or collecting live wood for firewood, and then to minimize the impacts that are unavoidable, such as trampling and soil compaction along the footpath. A study that consisted of point sampling was done on the trail, and it shows that it is in poor conditions where ridge top alignments and the flat land don't allow proper water drainage, and where steep slopes cause an excess of erosion. About 26% of the trail is considered to be in poor condition. The steepness of the slopes can be linked to how popular the path is and how often it sees hikers. The study also concluded that unsurfaced trail treads are susceptible to a variety of trail impacts. Common impacts include vegetation loss and compositional changes, soil compaction, erosion, and muddiness, exposure of plant roots, trail widening, and the proliferation of visitor-created side trails. Trails in the presence of visitors also impact wildlife, fragment wildlife habitat, and cause avoidance behavior in some animals and attraction behavior in others to obtain human food. LiveScience.com says that bears and bobcats are being pushed out due to hunting practices, but humans are attracting red foxes and raccoons. They mention that raccoons and red foxes are drawn to the scraps of human foods left behind. 20-year-old thru hiker David Leavitt completed the trail in October of 2017. He commented on some of the impacts he saw on his hike last year, and he said, "The trail from Northern Virginia to Vermont was near a lot of high population areas, and it got a lot of use. With the high usage, there's physical deterioration of the trail, especially in muddy areas or areas with fragile plant life. Trail organizations often build boardwalks over fragile areas to keep people off the mud and protect the ground from destruction. Rocks and boulders on the trail had scratches from the carbide tip of trekking poles, and sometimes there would be rubber marks on them too from people's shoes. Another high usage area was Georgia. Northbound hikers make up about 75% of the through hikers, and Georgia saw 100% of all who attempted a northbound hike, a lot of which are new to hiking and don't know the leave no trace principles very well yet. It was crowded, but there were trail ambassadors there to teach good outdoor ethics. The managers of the trail and a lot of the volunteers have been fighting to figure out how to keep impacts to a minimum. One strategy they have employed is the practice of leave no trace. There are 7 principles that leave no trace uses. 1 is to plan ahead and prepare. 2 is to travel and camp on durable surfaces. 3 is to dispose of waste properly. 4 is to leave what you find. 5, minimize campfire impacts. 6, respect wildlife. And 7, be considerate of others. To plan ahead and prepare is important because failure to prepare in advance may put you, others, and the environment at risk. What this looks like is basically just bringing clothes and gear that you'll need for protection, bringing maps, a reliable guidebook, a stove, and know how to use them. You can carry a litter bag and use it, and maybe bring a lightweight trowel for burying human waste, and then also to carry a tent or tarp and not rely entirely on shelters. To travel and camp on durable surfaces is important because a careless step can start a trend of impact. To do this, you should concentrate activities on durable surfaces like rocks, bare soil, and grass. You should also use existing campsites instead of making your own, and then also staying on the trail instead of shortcutting or switching back that could cause harmful erosion. To dispose of waste properly is important because improper waste disposal can spread disease, attract wildlife, and spoil the experience for other visitors. So you should carry out all the trash and food scraps to avoid attracting wildlife, disperse gray water at least 100 feet from campsites, and the same goes for urine, and then use a privy only for human waste and toilet paper. To leave what you find is also important because removing or altering natural or historic items harms wildlife habitat, scenery, and other cultural resources. Hikers can take photos, they just shouldn't carve or write on signs, shelters, bridges, trees, rocks, or other historic objects. They could also use rubber tips on trekking poles to help avoid trail soil erosion or scratch marks on rocks. Minimizing campfire impacts is also important because campfires reduce wood that replenishes soil and also provides habitat for wildlife, and also burning trash releases toxic chemicals. So hikers should use existing fire rings and only build small fires where it's legal and safe. They should also collect small amounts of dead and downed wood that are no bigger than their wrist. They can also burn all wood to ash and be sure that the fire is out and cool to the touch before leaving the site. Respecting wildlife is important because you're taking steps to minimize the influence that you have on wildlife behavior. This means you should avoid feeding wildlife intentionally or unintentionally to prevent attraction and habituation. And you should also store food, garbage, and scented items out of reach of animals using approved food storage devices like a bear canister. Or you could hang your food at least 12 feet above the ground and 6 feet out from a limb or trunk. You could leash and control your pets at all times or leave them at home, and then also observe wildlife and farm animals from a distance. And finally, being considerate of others is important because inconsiderate behavior distracts from the experience of others. So hikers can do this by respecting nature's quietness and others' wilderness experience by keeping loud voices and noises to a minimum. They can refrain from using cell phones or other audio equipment around others, and they can also share scenic areas as well as shelters and limiting how long they stay. Among the principles of the Leave No Trace Act, there have been other positive changes since the trail was originated. One of these positive changes was the use of shelters. AppalachianTrail.org says that there are more than 250 back county shelters located along the Appalachian Trail. They are built to house as many hikers as possible in order to reduce hikers' impact on the trail environment. Typically, these shelters have 3 or 4 walls, a roof, and a floor. They are basically one big open room, and they are on a first-come, first-served basis until they fill up. The problem with the shelter is that it has a carrying capacity, which isn't really a problem in and of itself, but the people who can't use it or don't use it have to set up camp or tent nearby off the trail. Thru hiker David Leavitt also commented on the shelters, saying, "Most of the shelters were small 5 to 6 person huts with 3 walls and a roof that were built every 5 to 15 miles on the trail. They differed in quality and design section to section, and it depends on who's maintaining it. They are mostly trash-free with the exception of when people thought it was okay to burn trash, which is a common misconception. There'd be unburned trash remnants, or sometimes people would leave trash in the fire pit for someone else to burn the next time there was a fire. Most hikers knew it was wrong and would correct or threaten others if they caught them trashing the fire pit. The only section where most of the shelters were bad was Tennessee, just north of the Smokies. The shelters were old and sketchy. The floors often bowed down to the center of the floor, making it hard for people to use it. A lot of shelters had 2 stories, a roofed cooking area, and rarely a door. I remember one in Vermont had a wood-burning stove, one in Virginia had a horseshoe game, and one in North Carolina had a solar-powered phone charging area. A good thing about the shelters is that they reduce campsite impacts. People staying at the shelter or camping around it don't have to build a new fire ring or clear out tenting area, which reduces the amount of illegal fire rings and clearing along the trail. I don't think shelters have much of a negative impact on wildlife, especially because it keeps campsite impact and human traffic to one area as opposed to many. While there are environmental concerns with the Appalachian Trail, there are recovery steps being put in place with the Leave No Trace principles and the use of shelters. The longer these recovery steps are implemented, the better the results will be for the trail.